Welcome to everyone who's joining us for our webinar this evening. As Susan mentioned, Bill 32 is what they call an omnibus piece of legislation, which means that it makes changes to multiple bills at the same time. Last week, we talked about the way Bill 32 makes changes to the Labor Relations Code, which is the law that governs unionized workplaces. Tonight, we're going to be dealing with the way Bill 32 makes changes to the Employment Standards Code. The Employment Standards Code, as many of you know, is the piece of legislation that affects all workers, primarily non-union, but also union as well. It's what we would describe as provides the floor of rights for workers in the province. So, and it covers everything from vacations and hours of work to the minimum wage, and these rules are put in place either through the legislation itself or through associated regulations, both of which are going to be affected by decisions of this government. So the first thing that I think needs to be said about the changes that Bill 32 makes to the Employment Standards Code is that they are all uniformly negative for working people. This government has been in power for a little over a year now. They've already made some changes to the Employment Standards Code and its associated regulations. Probably most notably, almost a year ago now, they introduced a youth minimum wage, which had the effect of cutting the minimum wage from $15 an hour to $13 an hour for Albertans under the age of 18. What's happening with Bill 32 builds on that very questionable foundation and just makes things worse for ordinary Albertans. Everything that this government has done to date and everything that they're going to do with this bill once it's passed involves taking away rights and protections for workers rather than adding them. Leanne is going to go into more detail about things that are being taken away, but I'll just skim over a few, and then once Leanne has spoken, we can go into them in more detail. But just to give you an example of what this bill does to the Employment Standards Code, in many ways, some of the changes might seem small, but it is an example of a death by 1,000 cuts. So, for example, there are changes made to the rights that workers have when they are terminated from employment. As a result of this legislation, they will have to wait longer for their final pay. In addition, workers are losing rights when it comes to layoffs. And I won't get into the detail. Leanne will do that, but basically, it gives employers more rights. Makes it easier for them to lay people off, and workers have fewer rights, or will have fewer rights as a result of this legislation. There are also rules that allow employers to more aggressively make deductions from employees' paychecks without the consent of the workers involved. And then, this legislation does mean-spirited things like reduce the number of rest breaks that workers are entitled to in the course of a workday. And at the same time, it also makes it easier for employers to avoid paying premium pay for statutory holidays. From my perspective, after having read the bill and debated it in different forums, the two biggest things that I'm concerned about that the bill does in terms of the Employment Standards Code have to do with overtime pay and variances and exemptions from the code. On the subject of overtime pay, this has actually been a big subject for discussion around the province. Basically, this bill does two things. The minister, in his defense of this bill, has said that, well, the basic overtime rules about premium pay for overtime hours worked, they haven't changed, and that's technically true. But this bill gives employers new tools to work around those basic requirements. In particular, we've always had what have been called overtime averaging agreements, which traditionally have allowed workers and employers to make an agreement about time off in lieu instead of premium pay. But the UCP with this bill has taken that idea of averaging agreements and turned it into a stick that employers can beat their employees with. They've done two things. First, instead of agreements, they've turned these, that have to be approved by the workers. They've turned these overtime agreements into what they call arrangements, which now can be imposed. So, I mean, the government has said that this bill is all about choice, for choice and flexibility. That's how they justify these changes. But by turning an agreement into an arrangement that can be imposed, that's clearly the opposite of choice. It's only choice for the employer, not for the worker. So it's not any choice at all. And the second thing that they do is that they extend the period in which these agreements can be in place. And once again, I should say arrangements, because I've gotten used to calling them overtime agreements. But it used to be that an overtime agreement could only be in place for 12 weeks. Now they have extended that to a year. So what that means is employers can basically avoid paying time and a half, which is guaranteed in other sections of the code, by simply averaging hours over the course of a whole year. So they just play with schedules to avoid paying premium pay. That's one of the big problems with it from the Employment Standards Code. The other big problem with Bill 32 from an Employment Standards Code perspective has to do with variances and exemptions. And I actually am worried that this is going to be the biggest problem with the bill. Here in Alberta, previous Conservative governments have created all sorts of opportunities for employers to apply for and receive exemptions or variances from the rules outlined in the Employment Standards Code. But in order to qualify for those exemptions and variances, there were some rules, and so employers had to apply. They had to give reasons. These reasons had to be adjudicated by the Director of Employment Standards within the Labor Department. Most of the time they got them, but they still had they had to defend them, and they didn't last for long. They were time limited, and every I think it was every trying to remember the term. Well, Leanne will probably get that, but it used to be they have to be renewed. But right now the if Bill 32 is passed, which it almost certainly will be, the scope for employers to use variances and exemptions to get out from under the basic minimum protections outlined in the Employment Standards Code will be vastly increased, and they won't be time limited. So once they get a variance, which will be easier for them to do under this law, they won't have to go back and reapply for it every couple of years. It'll basically be like a new set of rules for that set of employers. So it could be an individual employer, it can be a group of employers, it could be a whole industry. And what I'm afraid of is that certain industries, and my mind actually goes to the restaurant industry, because they've been most aggressive in their lobbying. Some industries are going to use these variances to avoid having to observe very significant protections in the Employment Standards Code. And so my question for UCP MLAs has been, what is the point of having rules if it's going to be so easy for employers to get out from under them? So in conclusion, and I'll wrap it up before I throw it over to Leanne. In conclusion, I would say that overall, the changes that are being made to the Employment Standards Code by Bill 32 are uniformly negative. They're all takeaways, they're all rollbacks, and there are no counterbalancing wins for workers. Second, the workers who are already struggling in our economy So part-time workers, precariously employed workers, seasonal workers, they're the ones who are going to be hit hardest by these changes. They already have it bad. Things are going to get worse for them. And that's particularly frustrating because of the experience that we've just had with COVID-19 and the associated recession. If this whole COVID situation has taught us anything, is that a lot of these workers who are at the bottom of the pile when it comes to pay and job security are in many ways the most important workers in our society. For a shining moment there, in March and in April, it seemed that people were starting to wake up to the importance of these workers and the need, and the need and the, to treat them with more respect. Not only by thanking them, but also by paying them well and treating them better. But with this piece of legislation, it seems that the UCP has learned nothing from the COVID crisis. They learned no lessons about the importance of these frontline workers, these lower paid workers who do so much for our economy and do so much for our communities, and their compassion for these workers has not increased at all, because if it had, they wouldn't be doing the kind of things that they're doing to them with this bill. And I'm just going to finish off my introduction with a quote, and this may seem a little melodramatic, but I do think it's appropriate. And this is something that a famous former American president said many years ago. It was Abraham Lincoln in 1864, and I use this quote because it's about the question of choice, freedom, and liberty. The UCP says that Bill 32 is all about giving more choice to workers and employers. It's about flexibility, freedom, liberty. This is what Abraham Lincoln said about those subjects. He said, and hang in there, it's a little bit of a long quote, but he said, "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not mean the same thing. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him as a destroyer of liberty. Plainly, the sheep and the wolf cannot agree upon the definition of liberty." With Bill 32, I would suggest that the UCP is giving liberty to the wolves at the expense of the lambs.
Thank you so much for that, Gil. I think it really contextualized some of the changes that are happening. Leanne?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my audio for Susan keeps going on and off. I don't know what that's about, but I didn't miss any of the important words, I don't think. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about employment standards in Bill 32. I think the simplest takeaway from Bill 32 is it doesn't achieve, at least in my opinion, what the government says it's supposed to be achieving. I think that Gil's analogy might be exactly right. And if you go on the government's website under their news, when they talked about this bill and what it was to mean, they have a link. You can go to a site called Restoring Balance in Alberta's Workplaces. And there you can access some nice little fact sheets that are made by the government to tell you what is good about this bill and what it means, and what positive things there are for people. And it's interesting because I would not have written the things that the government thinks are positive for employees as positives. So very much about your perspective as to whether something is actually a good thing or a bad thing. In any event, let's talk about the changes briefly. And so Bill 32 is divided into a number of parts. It's quite a long bill. It's over 80 pages. The changes to the employment standards codes are at the beginning of the bill, and they go up to page 20. Now, if you're reading this bill, you'll know that it has 2 pages of each number, because one page shows you the changes that are coming, and one shows you what the old bill or the old law means. Although if you really want to compare, you have to read the old law quite in its entirety. You can't just look at this little tiny section and necessarily understand it all. Employment standards code sets the minimum standards. It is always open for unions in a unionized workplace and an employer to negotiate better standards, better provisions for employees, and that often happens. But as the law changes or as the circumstances change, sometimes a union employer either didn't pay attention to a standard or it wasn't important to them, and it now is. The employment standards law, like other minimum protection laws such as human rights or occupational health and safety, will override the provisions of a collective agreement if the collective agreement provides less than the minimum standard. So the Employment Standards Code is very important to all workers, unionized and non-union, because it sets the floor. And as things change, it creates the floor. And so as that floor falls down and becomes lower and lower, that also impacts on all workers as well. It gives less protections to everyone. So if we go to, I would agree with Gil that some of the most important changes are to the pay and to the averaging. The first change that I think is important to talk about briefly is the final pay. Now, most of us hope we're never going to get terminated or laid off, and so maybe this won't apply to too many people. But the government has said that these changes will save employers in Alberta $100 million. And so that's a pretty dramatic savings that seems to come out of this change, and so that should make everyone stand up and pay attention. So under the existing law, when you are let go for not for cause, not for doing a bad thing, but simply for a layoff because there's not enough work or the workplace has changed and your job is no longer required, the employer has to pay you what you're owed within 3 days of the last day you work. So if you're let go at the end of the month, you don't have to wait to get that final paycheck to pay your rent or to buy your groceries or get your prescriptions filled. You have your pay within 3 days. And for those employees who were terminated for cause, or the employees who are very new, under 90 days of work, the employer had to pay within 10 days of the last day of work. So a little bit longer time, but not very much time. The new law, the new provision has been changed so that the employer has way more time to pay your final pay and your vacation pay and what's owed. So you have your perhaps 2 weeks. Some people work on a monthly basis, even a month's worth of pay due, and they decide to lay you off. Now the employer can wait much longer than they would have in the normal cycle. Now they have to pay you within either, and the employer gets to choose, not you, not the worker, either within 10 days after the end of the pay period in which you were terminated, or within 31 days after the last day of employment. So you could end up having to wait a whole month from the last day of work to get paid for the money that you earned in the month prior. Now, the employee is out looking for a new job, doesn't have money coming in from this pay period, and is now waiting up to 31 days. The government, this is interesting because they talked a lot about why they did this, and they talked about, well, running an extra paycheck outside of the normal timeline is what's costing this $100 million extra. And so it doesn't make sense, because it would have been simple if that was really their concern, is to say that you had to be paid no later than the next normal payroll day after you get terminated, whether that's 3 days or 4 days or 6 days. And at least then the worker wouldn't be waiting that long, and it would make sense tied to the purpose they're talking about. So it seems simply really just a way to save employers money. They can fire people and not have to pay them until a month later. They can earn interest on that money in the bank. They can use it for other purposes, or worse, go bankrupt in the 31 days and not pay anyone at all. So there is some real problems with this, but it's more important to the individual employee who really needs that money. Averaging arrangements are also really quite a dramatic change. Under the current rules, and under the new law, a union and an employer can create an averaging arrangement to deal with a workplace that needs to have, say, longer hours or a shorter work week with time off, more days off, longer days of work. And that continues to be allowed. And that's something that unions and employers have negotiated for many, many years. Under the existing law, if the employer wanted to do that with a non-union situation, they had to get the permission of the employees to sign on an agreement. They've taken away the agreement side of that, and now the employer can just unilaterally impose this new arrangement on 2 weeks' notice. So, you know, suddenly you took a job and you thought it was going to go one way, and suddenly it has changed on very little notice, not enough time usually to go find another job. And so you're stuck there. And the change is dramatic. It used to be that you averaged the hours over 12 weeks max. Now the employer can average the hours that you would be working over 52 weeks. So if I work 6 months of the year and I have 6 months off because I'm a seasonal worker, for example, or I'm in a position that's temporary, if they average it over 52 weeks, you can, without being any kind of math whiz, you're going to understand that they can immediately wipe out all the overtime, because half the time you're not working at all. If I average in 6 months of non-work to 6 months of working all the time, every day, as many hours as possible, I'm still going to end up getting paid zero for overtime. So, you know, some people talk about this as the pick your pockets legislation, and Gil talked about a death by 1,000 cuts, but this is actually a pretty strong death, if you like, or cut, because it could take an employee who's used to getting paid overtime regularly and just get rid of all of it. Remember, the point of overtime work is to encourage employers to let workers go home to get sufficient amount of rest, time in the community, time with their families, so they can come to work the next day refreshed and ready to work safely, to work hard, and to be efficient. Overtime is seen as a problem because it tires out the workers. It doesn't allow them that time to recharge. It keeps them working when they are tired and they might be less safe. And furthermore, the more overtime I assign, the less full-time jobs I've made, the less job for the next person in the community to have a full-time job. So the concept of making overtime cost more is a penalty to encourage workers, their employers, to either assign the work to fit into a normal day, or to hire more workers so that everyone in the community can work. And what this does is it takes away that entire disincentive to take those kinds of approaches, and instead allows an employer to average this over a really long time, which will effectively take out overtime in many, many cases entirely. This is particularly going to be a problem for people who are working seasonally, who work in short-time project kind of work, for people who are often temporary foreign workers. And you can see it in areas like construction or any landscaping, things that happen particularly during specific periods of the year. Moving on to layoffs, two things are important. Under the current law, if you were going to get laid off, you get a week's notice if you've been there for under 2 years, and you get 2 weeks notice if you've been there for over 2 years. And that 2 weeks notice, or 1 week if you're a shorter term, gives you time to start getting your affairs in order, gives you time to start looking for another job, to get your resume together, to pack up your personal belongings, and to tidy up and get your work finished so that you will get a good reference as you go. Now the employer doesn't have to give you any notice, any amount of notice. It just has to be in writing. So they could say, well, we laid off today, here's your notice in writing. It used to be that you could be temporarily laid off for 60 days within a 120-day period. So the idea of a short-term layoff, we don't have work this week, we got to send you home early, we're laid off, come back in 3 weeks, we have work again, it's a comfortable understanding of how things work in a unionized environment where there are rights about recall. Often benefit packages continue during a laid off period if you're having short-term layoffs in a unionized environment. And there's other benefits to that. But in a non-union environment, this temporary layoff has an impact because the employee feels tied to the first job, has difficulty getting the second one because the second employer is going to say, well, as soon as you get recalled, you're going to quit. So I don't want to hire you. I'll hire someone who doesn't have this right under the statute. They've changed that now so that it's now 90 days as opposed to 60 days. The other piece that's really important is when you're laid off, you get your pay in lieu of notice under the Employment Standards Code, which is 2, 4, 6 weeks pay. When you're laid off, you don't get it until the 60 or 90 days pass. So it's a longer time before the employees get their pay in lieu of notice on the temporary layoff, which allows the employer to operate longer without giving the employees what they're entitled to. And so both the notice of the layoff and the termination pay have been impacted by this amendment. Variances, Gail's already talked about this, and there's not a lot to add. It used to be that when the employer could go to the government and ask for a variance of any employment standards for their particular industry. We need to have a change because our industry requires longer hours or different rules about overtime or vacation or whatever. And it used to be that the director had to look at both, could they give that kind of variance? Was it authorized? And secondly, were they satisfied that issuing the variance or exception meets the criteria established by the regulations? Well, they're just eliminating that second piece entirely. So now if you are allowed to ask for a variance, the employer can ask for variance, and they ask, there's no criteria, so they just get it, I guess, if they ask. So that's the only requirement. So there's no kind of government oversight. Is it really appropriate to give a variance to this minimum floor standard for this particular employer? And so that is a particularly important change. And then the 2-year limit. It used to be every 2 years you had to come back. Your variances would be over after 2 years. If you wanted it to continue, you'd apply again. Had to convince the minister or the director again that met the criteria set out in the regulations. Now they can get a variance and it lasts until you ask for it to be gone. There's no automatic coming back. So it can go on for forever, I guess, or until the law changes again. And there's no regular oversight, even as things might change in the business, as conditions might make that variance inappropriate or unsafe or what have you. That changes, the group termination provisions that were brought in by the NDP allowed for a greater amount of notice of a termination if the employer was going to terminate 50 or more people. And the amount of notice went up depending on how many people, to as high as 16 weeks notice if over 300 people were going to be terminated within a short period of time. This allowed for people to get notice, to start making plans. It allowed for the government and the employees to work together to look for alternative work or mitigation strategies to try and maybe avoid that big layoff. It got people involved. Now that's gone, and all that the people have to do, the employer has to do, is give 4 weeks notice to the minister if 50 or more people are going to be terminated, and that's all they have to do. One of the nice things that used to protect employees from an employer messed up their pay and paid them too much. And surprisingly, this happens more than you think. And an aside, everyone should always check their pay to make sure it's correct. But you would be shocked to find out how many people don't on all levels of skill, education, and pay. Now, if the employer overpays you, or they pay you vacation pay early and they want it back, they can just deduct it from your paycheck without any specific authorization. And even more importantly, there's no cap put on as to how much they can deduct. So if the employer overpays you by $2,000 and you're getting paid $2,000 a month, conceivably the employer could take your whole paycheck without notice and just pay it back to themselves. And that would be, for many employees, a tragedy because they would have no money to pay rent or any of their bills. And so that is a significant change for employees. And it's because, and remember, this is overpayments because of the employer's mistake, not the employee's mistake. Rest periods, this is shocking to me. If you work 9 hours and 59 minutes, you're only now entitled to 1 30-minute break. You have to work, you know, it used to be that if you worked 5 hours, you got a break. If you worked in the next 5 hours, you got another break. Now you have to work over 10 hours to get 2 30-minute breaks, paid or unpaid. So this doesn't have to cost, these breaks don't have to cost the employer anything if the employer chooses to do them as unpaid. Statutory holidays. So it used to be, first of all, that your average wage that was used to calculate your statutory holiday pay was based on a combination of vacation pay and general holiday and wages. Now they've changed that. For this particular provision, wages only means wages, which is not including vacation pay or general holiday pay. And it used to be that there was a period of time that they would look back and say, let's take that total wages, vacation, and holiday pay over 4 weeks preceding the holiday, and then you would get 5% of that, which is basically 1 day's worth of pay out of that time. Now it's changed, so the employer is calculating the pay on just wages, not those other items. as well as they get to choose which period that they want to use. So the employer can pick the one that's cheaper for them. And go back to the time when employers often used to manipulate days off to try to ensure that people got paid a little less for statutory holidays. The one thing, and I'll disagree with Gil on one point, there is one good thing in this bill for employees, is that it confirms what we already knew, that time off on one of the leaves that the NDP added to the law, including, like, for example, sick leave, continues to be counted toward your years of service for calculation of vacation, annual vacation entitlements. Now, we knew that was the case, but this is the small clarification. So overall, this doesn't restore any balance. None of this was unbalanced. The employees, all of the things that have been taken away, as you can see, are not particularly generous or great for an employee in the first place. So there's no balance to restore. It tips the balance in favor of employers. It is a nickel and diming or pick your pocket or the 1,000 cuts. And some of the cuts are actually pretty deep, in my opinion. And this is for workers who don't have a union to represent them, workers who are often vulnerable and often have no bargaining power and often feel very unable to stand up for themselves. And so again, it's very hard to understand why this legislation is necessary and why the government feels this will help anyone. And it's very hard to watch when they say that they are standing up for ordinary working Albertans with laws like Bill 32. So I'll answer questions as they come up.
Thank you so much for that, Leanne. That breakdown point by point is exactly what we need, because it's what's not happening out there for all the people to know what this bill is about. So just some of the questions. The very first question that we got, and I think Gil is in the position to answer this, is what is the best way to fight against this bill?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I'm not sure I have a good answer. The reality is that the UCP has a majority, and they will point out that this bill implements many things that were included in their 110-page campaign manifesto, which they argue gives them a mandate to do these things. The reality is that virtually no one read that document. I'm probably one of the few people who did read it cover to cover. But a lot of the things that we see in Bill 32 were explicitly outlined. In fact, during the election campaign, I remember, talking myself hoarse, trying to convince people about the dangers of what they had planned for overtime averaging agreements. I remember arguing with right-wing radio talk show hosts, that this would rob people of overtime, and which was, it's a big issue for all workers, but here in Alberta, because we have so many people working in seasonal industries and in industries like construction, we have a disproportionate number of people who rely on overtime for their annual income, and what I said at the time was that all of that's going to disappear. So if you're counting on 20% overtime for 20% of your wage, you're going to lose that 20%. And I was accused of being a fearmonger. Well, here it is. But so that being as it may, the reality is that they have a majority. They are impervious to criticism and public pressure. We are encouraging people to support our campaign on these issues. We call it the Defend Worker Rights campaign. So there's a campaign website, defendworkerrights.ca. If you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to visit the site, sign up for our campaign. We will ask you to send emails to your MLAs, but more importantly, we're trying to collect lists of people to continue pushing back against these attacks on workers' rights over the next 3 years leading up to the next election. So if you haven't done that already, please do so, and we'll just keep fighting. We're probably going to lose this battle, but we are going to keep reminding people about this bill and what it means, and more importantly, what it shows about the UCP. And it shows very clearly that they are not on the side of ordinary working people. I think a lot of people weren't clear about that in the last election, but with the passage of this bill, that's becoming more and more clear. So what can you do about it? Join our campaign, talk to your friends, make sure people understand, what what the government is doing to ordinary working people with this kind of legislation. We need to get the word out. We need to help people understand that supporting this government is really not good for working people, and it's also important for people to understand that Jason Kenney, if you're a working person, Jason Kenney and his caucus, they're not your friends.
So some of the viewers, they're wondering about kind of the context. So the UCP is claiming this is restoring balance, but in some of the changes, it seems like it's going even further than the employment standards were like 5 years ago. And there's questions about, do other jurisdictions have similar legislation to this? Like, one specific question is, do other jurisdictions allow people to be laid off with no notice? And then historically, have we seen legislation like this, or is this actually out of the ordinary for some of the legislation in Canada now?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a first crack at that one, if that's okay, Leanne. When defending this legislation, the UCP say two things. The first thing that they say is that the previous government under the NDP swung the balance of power in labor relations far, far in favor of working people. And then they follow that up very quickly by saying that we're not only restoring balance, but we're just returning Alberta's labor relations system to where it was before the New Democrats came to power and made the changes that they did to our workplace laws. Both of those points, that the New Democrats swung labor legislation way over to workers, and that the UCP is just putting things back the way they were, both of those are false. The reality is that when the New Democrats made their changes to the Labor Relations Code and the Employment Standards Code in 2018, they very explicitly were moving Alberta into what they described as the Canadian mainstream. So, for years, under the 44 years of Conservative government before the New Democrats were elected, we fell behind other provinces in terms of basic workplace rights and protections. And as the president of the AFL at the time, I remember lobbying the Notley government and saying, let's do something big here. And I remember Premier Notley saying, well, let's bring us to the Canadian mainstream before we think about doing other big things. And that's what she did. So it was not swinging way over. We just gave Albertans for the first time in many, many years the same kind of rights and protections as other Canadians have been taking for granted for years. And then the second point, that they're just putting things back the way they were, that's also false, because on almost, on so many different levels, this bill, whereas the New Democrats brought us into the Canadian mainstream, this bill takes us out of the Canadian mainstream. We used to be at the back of the pack. Now we're not even close to the pack. We're off the track. So whether it's overtime averaging agreements, other provinces have those, but they're no longer agreements. And for all the reasons that both Leanne and I have explained, this has become a punitive system, a tool that employers will be able to use to get around paying premium pay for overtime at all. There's no other jurisdiction in Canada that has anything like that. The other part of Bill 32, of course, deals with the Labor Relations Code, and in many respects, that's the even worse part of the bill, and it is legislated union busting, and but with this legislation, they're taking us out of the Canadian context. We were behind the pack before, but now we're not even in the same context. And labor law, whether it's Employment Standards Code or the Labor Relations Code, it's going to look more like the kind of labor relations system that you have in some backwater Republican American state where workers have very few rights. We're going to look more like them as a result of this legislation than we do other Canadian jurisdictions. And that's what people have to understand. This is not about restoring balance. It's about tipping the scales. This is not about returning to the way things were. It's about making them much, much worse. The final thing I'll say on that point is that this proves what I've said all along, that this government is not really a conservative government, it's a radical government. This is a radical departure from Canadian traditions, norms, and practices. So people thought they were voting for conservatives that would conserve the status quo. That's the last thing they got. They got a radical government that's turning everything upside down.
Leanne, do you have anything to add?
Maybe a couple points. One is, I'm not sure about notice of layoff in other provinces, but I would be surprised. Now, I should point out, you are still entitled to termination pay under the Employment Standards Code once you've been laid off, but as I said, now you have to wait 90 days before that layoff is permanent, before you would get that termination pay. So no notice, laid off, wait 3 months and to get your termination pay. And it's not very much either. It's 2 weeks for working up to 2 years. And so it's not a lot of termination pay either. I think that I would have to check the other provinces, but I would be surprised if they had no notice. And the other thing is, if you sort of consider what the government's been doing, especially the federal government, but other provinces have been doing for COVID, where employers are caught in a situation where they have, due to no fault of their own, the market has changed, the requirements have changed, people have to stay home. So they've had to deal with massively changing workplaces on no notice themselves, nothing that they could have predicted was coming. And what you see is the federal government stepping in and covering off pay for people, so that they have some notice of what's coming, cushioning their pay. I think that I wouldn't necessarily call the current federal government particularly left-wing. I think that when we look to them, we can say that maybe is a bit more of an indication of where Canadians in a sort of mainstream way would think the minimum support ought to come from government or from employers in times that are trying, including when I need to lay off employees for whatever reason. And we're not seeing that in Alberta. We're seeing a real shift towards employees have no right. And cutting red tape for employers really means just cutting all of the rights for employees, or almost all of them. The other thing that I didn't mention, and I should have, is there's still more to come under this employment standards. They have announced that they're going to also make some changes in the regulations. They're going to make it easier for 13 and 14-year-old people, children, to have more work. Because I guess that restores some kind of balance to employers so they can get the kids out working as well. And so that's still more to be seen as we watch.
So some of the people watching are talking about how the labor market is really brutal right now, that unemployment is really high, and that essentially the UCP is taking advantage of the situation when Albertans are already struggling. But there's also hope that maybe things would get so bad that everyone leaves Alberta and then employers essentially start to change things on their own. So I think one of the things the question is asking is do good employers need legislation like this?
I'm going to encourage Leanne to take that one because we were talking about this the other day and she had a good answer.
Well, I wonder if I can remember it then. I think that good employers don't need any of Bill 32, not a single bit of it. I don't think a decent regular employer who maybe is unionized, even if they have some non-union people in part of their operation, is getting anything from this legislation. They'll just carry on doing what they do. None of this is necessary. There's no balance they need restoring. There's nothing that's going to give them any benefit because they're not going to do any of these things that are available to them. But it certainly leaves those employers who are, themselves perhaps on an edge or who are not as concerned about the rights of their employers. Or their employees to have lots more options to make changes. But employers don't have to follow this. They can do better, and hopefully they will do better. I think that leaving Alberta point, or leave this job for a better one point, how, or go back to school and get some more education, or to college, or to trade school, because I'm not making it point, which I've seen that happen in my lifetime. It, is another indication. It's not protecting the workers, it's making it unattractive for workers to work at all. Better to go do something else or go somewhere else. That truly affects employers in a negative way, because they can't suffer. And again, we have a immediate example of what happens when there's not enough workers with COVID-19, where we've had a whole bunch of workers had to withdraw from the workplace. And so we see what happens. Those businesses can't survive. So it's not necessarily helping those businesses who are on the edge either, because the employees won't take that work. So I'm trying to answer, but there you go.
Yeah, well, I just want to take a crack at that answer too. Like, we've been saying that this bill is all about giving employers what they want. But I would actually qualify that by saying that this is actually a piece of legislation for bad employers. People who are mean-spirited, people who want to squeeze their employees, people who want to do the worst possible. And so, by dropping the floor and providing them all these new workarounds to avoid being decent employers and getting away with it, it's about providing new rights for bad employers. And obviously that's bad for the people who have the misfortune of working for these employers, but I would also argue it's bad for good employers, because they have to compete with these bad employers who are now empowered by this legislation. And so it might actually force good employers to become less good employers in order to compete with the bad apples. And I also think it's counterproductive. I mean, in terms of the economy, oil is not going to save the day anymore. People used to come here, companies used to invest here because we had a booming economy based on oil and gas. That's no longer the case, and is not likely to be the case anytime in the near future. So we're going to have to start competing for investment and for people in the same way as other jurisdictions have for years. And I tell you, as a result of the UCP, their policy, their tone, this is not attracting people to this province. So, they're driving doctors away. They're, returning our province to being an environmental pariah. And now they're passing labor legislation that, looks like Mississippi or Alabama. These are the exact opposite things of what government should be doing at a difficult economic time in order to attract people. So we're going to get this reputation of being the Alabama of the North, and frankly, based on legislation like this, and what the UCP is doing to our healthcare system, to our public services, to our education, to our universities, it will be a well-deserved reputation, and it won't attract people and investment. It will repel them.
And I'm just going to add, I think one of the things that a lot of this legislation contributes to is growing inequality in our province. So there will be workers that will be able to leave because their skill set or their education is desirable in another province, and they have the ability to, maybe they have family here or they don't have other demands that force them to stay. And those people will leave, but there were plenty of people who that's not a realistic option, and they will have to deal with whatever policies and legislation are coming out and however it affects them. So you'll end up with a growing inequality. And we know that locations, whether they're countries or provinces or state that have growing inequality, everyone suffers with that because it affects all facets of our society. So one of the other questions that people have is does the bill have an effect on workers who are trying to unionize or trying to organize right now? So workers who are trying to improve their work sites, is there any impact?
Maybe I'll start. So the changes to the rights to organize are in the changes to the Labor Relations Code part of Bill 32. And just to quickly recap, because it does have an impact on those rights, quite a significant one, frankly. The UCP already, when they first came out, had a bill called Bill 2, which they enacted. And sorry, I've forgotten the name of that one. I had it here a minute ago. But it was intended, one of the big things that they did, it was called the Act to Make Alberta Open for Business. Strange name. They took away, with certification, what the NDP had brought in was if, I think it's 60 or 65% of the workers wanted to join the union and had taken the time to show support for the union by signing up, the labor board could then make a certification order in favor of the union without having a second requirement for those workers to go and again explain their position by casting a vote. Now, lots of people talk about that as who are from the UCP talk about, well, we restored the balance by giving those workers their free vote, but you know, there's no way for a union who's an outsider to the workplace to actually compel a worker to agree to sign on to join the union. There's really they have no authority or power over that worker while they're non-union. So it's a strange restoration. They'd already taken that and added the vote is now mandatory. Whether or not even 100% of the workers sign on to join the union, they still have to have another vote. It's very disrespectful of the fact that workers make their choices thoughtfully and carefully. It's like they're children, so we have to make them decide a second time, just in case they didn't know what they were doing the first time, which is very insulting. Now under Bill 32, under the Labor Code side, they've also changed it so that in terms of certification, under the old law, the existing law before the change, there's a very strict time limits for certification application to go through. It has to be started and finished within 21 days, including any vote, any hearings about issues about the certification itself. And so that short timeline made a major change in the opportunity for employers to exert pressure on employees to change their mind or to scare them that if the union came in, they would lose their jobs or the workplace would shut down or what have you. And so that time limit, even with the vote being added back in, still kept things closer to imbalance. It kept employers from really having the time to do too much damage. Now they have taken those time limits out, and instead, a certification application has to be completed within 6 months, which is a ridiculously long amount of time before it needs to be done. The second thing is they have it. We did allow under the existing laws, if there's bad enough employer behavior, there could be a certification, even if the union didn't have sufficient support in membership cards because the employer had scared people or threatened them or fired people to the point where the union members were just too scared to exercise their choice. Now they have limited that remedy to be allowed only in cases where the Labor Relations Board is absolutely satisfied that there is no other remedy that could counteract the impact of the inappropriate actions on a vote. So it's now a remedy of very last resort and likely to be used very, very seldomly. So, and finally, the new law allows unions to close the open period. So this is a bit more complicated to explain, but if there's a union in place and there's a collective agreement, after the second year and any years following, if it's a longer than 2-year agreement, then last 2 months, in month 10 and month 11, the workers in that workplace can get rid of the union. If they don't think the union is doing a good job for them, they can decertify the union, or they can just invite another union, one they think will be a better representative, to come in and certify them instead, so they can go from union to non-union or union to a new union at their choice. And this gives workers the rights to choose who the representative is. And it's one of the ultimate controls that union members have over their union doing a good job. And so now the law has taken a practice that had developed that was found by the courts and by the labor board to be an intrusion into the free choice of workers to choose their union. So probably a constitutional right, a charter right to choose your own union. And they have made it lawful for unions and employers to close the open period early. So the employer and a employer-friendly union can get together and make a new collective agreement early before that 10 and 11th month in the last 2 years or following years of the collective agreement. as long as they tell the workers that, well, this means you won't have an open period, which most workers don't understand what that means, they can then get them to vote on the new collective agreement, which usually has some incentive to get them to sign off. And then they can't go and change to a new union after that. They're stuck again for another 2 or more years. And so it's a practice that is, again, assist the employer with an employer-friendly union to override the free wishes of the members. If the union is doing a good job for the members in standing up to the employer in a fair way, there's no need for this closing of the open period. And so it's really seen as a way to block more worker-friendly unions from getting into the door. So those are the main reasons why Bill 32 makes it harder to unionize.
Thank you so much for that, Leanne. So I'm just going to turn it over to Gil for our closing remarks. And some people are just wondering, what does this future hold then? Are there constitutional challenges in the future that are coming? Do you think back to work legislation for some government workers might be in the future as well? And just what is the role for workers in really the fight back strategy, all workers, so unionized, non-unionized, and government workers? So if you could tie those into your closing remarks, that would be fantastic.
And I'll do that all in a minute and a half. Well, thanks, Susan, and thanks, Leanne, and thanks for everyone who has joined us this evening for this important discussion. You know, these are very troubling times for workers in Alberta and for the labor movement. As you can imagine, the leaders of our unions have been meeting intensely for the past couple of weeks since Bill 32 was tabled. We knew it was going to be bad, but in many ways it's worse than we had feared. And we're not only afraid for our organizations, for our members, for workers in this province, we're also afraid for the precedent that this legislation will set for the entire country. So with that in mind, we haven't only been talking amongst ourselves, we've actually been talking with our counterparts in other provinces and at the federal level. You know, this is a 5-alarm fire situation when it comes to workers' rights. We think that the UCP and their conservative allies in other provinces are very consciously trying to create a beachhead for American-style union-busting anti-worker legislation right here in Alberta. And if they're successful, we're afraid that it will be enthusiastically introduced in other provinces. So it's really imperative for the, you know, in terms of the rights of Alberta workers, that we draw a line in the sand and we say this shall not pass here in this province for our own sake, but also for the country. Because I mean, you know, what we have here with Bill 32, whether it's, you know, union busting tactics or dropping the floor of rights for all workers, you know, this, you know, if this is allowed to stand, it would be a fundamental transformation, not only to Canadian, you know, workplace laws, but to Canadian society. Because I mean, like I keep reminding people that labor law should not be seen, you know, as something apart from society. We all spend probably the majority of our waking lives at work, and so if things get bad for people at work, they get bad for people everywhere. So, you know, and workplace rights are the cornerstone of our democracy, and unions are a cornerstone of civil society. So if things get bad at work, and if we, you know, unions are weakened as a cornerstone of civil society, it will not just change our workplaces, it'll change our society. And that's a big deal. So, you know, so what can you expect? Well, the labor movement has already been coming together. We've been meeting, we've created a campaign called defendworkerrights.ca. And once again, I'll give it a plug. If you haven't visited our website, please do and sign up. You can help us at the moment pushing back against the UCP and the legislature. But if you join the campaign, you'll also be joining us for the next 3 years in terms of our escalating fight back. And I'll emphasize that word escalating, because we are going to escalate things. We will be making an announcement very shortly about our plans in terms of challenging Bill 32 in the courts. And that will be an important part of our work going forward. But I want to make it really clear that we can't wait for the courts, because a court challenge will take, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. and a lot of damage can be done in that time. So we're going to have to take it to the streets, and what that looks like, especially in a pandemic, we're not sure. But this is this is not just your usual conservative government that has issues that we have issues with. This is a fundamental attack on the fabric of Canadian society, and so the protests are going to have to be big. They have to be sustained, and it can't just be the labor movement. So we are reaching out to social partners. So all I can say is, like, there are more details coming. I know it's probably frustrating for you to hear, like everyone wants to know, but we're having all sorts of conversations, and we will be making announcements this week about some aspects of our efforts, and then there'll be more announcements in the coming weeks. So stay tuned, but it's not going to work unless we have lots of people involved.
Thank you so much, Gil and Leanne, for coming and hosting this with me again, and letting people know kind of what's going on with Bill 32. So we'll send a follow-up email to all of the participants, and that's everything for tonight. So thank you so much. I hope everyone has a great evening.